Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, it's a bit of a hectic morning for reasons I don't want to bother getting into, but I want to get the new episode up before Thursday evening, so here we are. Now, my guest for this second episode of the week is Christopher Brown, who has a new novel out this week called Failed State from Harper Voyager. Failed State is set in the same dystopian America as Chris's previous novels, Tropic of Kansas and Rule of Capture. And like Rule of Capture, its lead character is the hustling attorney Donnie Chemo. Now, in this book, America's in a post-reconciliation phase after a grotesque civil war fueled by environmental collapse, basically. And Donnie is caught in a web of plots as he tries to get justice for people who were disappeared by the previous regime, find a way to pay off his loan sharks, maybe, as it turns out, figure out a new legal code that can reboot the nation's relationship to the earth, and figure out exactly what happened to the previous president. Now, I loved Chris's first two novels, and Failed State did not let me down at all. He gets better and better at storytelling, integrating legal concepts and how power dynamics dictate so many of our relationships, while also sort of bringing in this great concern for, well, how we can repair the environment before the damage that we've caused is irreversible. And this book takes place largely in Dallas, Houston, and a very post-apocalyptic New Orleans. Rather than call it dystopian, Chris actually refers to it as a sort of working out of utopia, which we'll talk about during the conversation. It certainly makes for an interesting concept, especially given where we are at this very, very moment. Now, Donnie is a great character. You will probably envision him as Saul Goodman of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul fame. I certainly hear his dialogue as spoken by Bob Odenkirk whenever I read Chris's stuff, and that's not a bad thing by any means. It sort of gets away some of the mental lifting you have to do to envision a lead character. Anyway, Failed State is a blast. The story is compelling, and the greater concerns it raises about the law, power, the environment, and how we live together in this time of transition, well, those are critical to every one of us, whether we cop to it or not. Now, in addition to Failed State, there's another work of Chris's that I want to cite, and that's his wonderful weekly email called Field Notes. You can find that at edgelands.substack.com, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Every Sunday morning, Chris sends out this sort of meditation on life in the edgelands of Austin, Texas, with great photos and links to other writers and thinkers in that space between the natural and the engineered. I'm not doing this justice. It's an absolute joy. So I always link to them in the weekly newsletter that I send out. Go check out Field Notes and, of course, pick up Failed State out this week from Harper Voyager. Now, as caveats go, not a lot. Audio was a little loud. He was on AirPod Pros, which I can't use because I'm allergic to them, and they cause this horrible blistering on my ears and inside my ears when I try using them. That was not a happy discovery to make, I'll be honest. Anyway, we talk over each other a few times. That leads to a couple of pauses, but That's pandemic life, man. Chris has been on the show twice now in person, plus one COVID check-in episode back in April. So we get a little looser than some of my first-time guests, but at the same time, we also both barge in over each other for the same reason. Anyway, here's Chris's bio from Failed State. Christopher Brown's debut novel, Tropic of Kansas, was a finalist for the Campbell Award for Best Science Fiction Novel of 2018, and he was a World Fantasy Award nominee for the anthology 3 Messages and a Warning. His short fiction and criticism has appeared in a variety of magazines and anthologies, including MIT Technology Review, LitHub, Tor.com, and The Baffler. He lives in Austin, Texas, where he also practices law. His new book is Failed State. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Christopher Brown.
How are you?
All right. Dealing. New Jersey's starting to look better again. We were just starting to creep back up because of what our governor refers to as knuckleheads, throwing 600-person house parties and all that. But the last week or so, we're down to about 350 new cases a day. Hospitals are doing all right. We're in decent shape, having gone through, well, the way I put it, you and I recorded 4 months ago just about, and at the time, we actually sort of wondered if we would be able to do this one in person.
Yeah.
When the book comes out. And
I had the idea I might be doing, actual bookstore signings.
Yeah, it did not turn out the way we even semi-optimistically thought things would go. But
no,
we're dealing. Here in New Jersey, like I say, we're in better shape, certainly than we were back in April. But it's, you had Jan Michael Vincent hair at the time. I'm headed towards like full afro. There was a point a couple of weeks ago where I saw myself in a reflection wearing sunglasses, and with the beard and the hair, I looked like a photo negative of Jeff Lynne from ELO. I realized this is all going to get worse. Frankly, this is all going to go downhill.
Do you have what song comes to your mind when you see that?
Well, with ELO, it's usually Mr. Blue Sky, but in this case, yeah, that doesn't really hold up particularly well. I guess Turn to Stone is my default other one, but Horace Wimp is the absolute bizarre B-side that nobody knows, but
I cringe at the very thought of that band. I don't know why. It's just one of those. I never connected with that. It's pretty funny.
I'm hip. I listen to terrible prog rock, and as you may or may not remember, my first concert was Asia, so I can't be a music snob.
I love it. Well, I'm all about the prog rock. I'm all about Roger Dean album covers and long. In fact, I was watching some weird Yes video last night where they're like they're on a beach on some Neolithic stone platform out into the water. Yeah, New Jersey sounds like
bands that were not meant for video. But, sorry.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like it's more like art film than video, right? That's the idea of like 70s music videos. But Texas, we didn't really get a first wave when you all got it. And then this time around, kind of since July 4th, it's been pretty bad, a lot worse. I just ran into a buddy of mine who's a former bike messenger turned fireman, and he was headed out for his Sunday morning cycle, and baby and I were walking the dogs, and he was talking about what it's like being a firefighter right now. Just he's driving the engine this summer, and that there are these kind of like flop house old Motel 6s along the interstate frontage road in his precinct, where they go and go out on the kind of the COVID calls, and without getting into the grisly details, it's pretty heavy stuff going on out there. But I feel like there's a distribution of suffering that's very unequal, that sort of highlights the inequality that already exists in society and the way this thing's playing out. And that's part of what makes it so grim and so hard to really kind of fully fathom the depth of what's going on.
Sure. I mean, I micro break stuff down, or at least I go in my county, town by town, looking around. And weirdly, my town of about 12,000 people, really spread out, a lot of hills, a lot of woods. We have the lowest per capita of any town in our county, which is one of the 4 worst in New Jersey, which is second worst, or had been second worst for so long in the country. But you go to Patterson, which city, poor minority populations, the levels of both positive cases and fatalities is just ridiculous. It's enormous compared to, almost anywhere else in the state. And it's,
that's,
we knew this was going to come. And once they started breaking stuff down demographically, nationwide, we started to learn that, yeah, it's tough. It highlights so much of America.
Yeah, I've been reading As It Happens, slight sort of on the same subject, but slight change of subject. I've been reading a book this week set in the wilderness of New Jersey.
Is this what Henry Wessels was on about?
It may be. I don't know. I was talking to Henry Wessels about this book a couple of weeks ago. It's called The Tracker. And it's by this guy, Tom Brown, who, then it's kind of like the Carlos Castaneda of the Pine Barrens. It's about this this guy. It's supposedly a memoir, and you kind of read it and you're sort of skeptical because it's about how he has this buddy growing up near the Pine Barrens, and his buddy has a grandpa who's an Apache Indian who teaches them like all of the ways to kind of read animal tracks and other signs in the land, and how they become sort of closer to nature as kind of like working class New Jersey kids. It's pretty far out. And I've never been to the Pine Barrens, so it really makes me want to go check it out. So maybe post-COVID, I can come up there and we can go explore the Pine Barrens.
You can come up now, but you'll be in quarantine for 2 weeks, which we're doing for, I think, 35 states across the country. If you come in here with those license plates, the cops will take a look and wonder where you're headed and try to get you to stay in one place for 2 weeks. So
I know, it's so crazy.
I mean, my garage
Gil,
is okay, but,
yeah. I know. I mean, last
if you wanted
year,
to stay in the garage, that's all I mean. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, the book I had that came out last year, Rule of Capture, I imagine these scenarios in which governors started closing off the borders of their states to like internal refugees. And I had thought it was so sort of science fictional. Invented that conceit, and it's like not even a full year, like 6 months later, it started to happen. It's just crazy. So,
the previous guest I have is Kurt Anderson, and I asked him the same thing. I'm going to ask you. Could you maybe just stop? Like maybe this is a Borges thing where you're actually evoking these sorts of things to happen. So maybe just chill the hell out a little while.
Well, that's why I tried in the new book. I tried to be a little more utopian. So maybe but although, I mean, my utopia is still kind of dark. So.
Yeah, it is. In fact, tell us, I finished it a couple of days. Actually, I binged through it pretty hardcore, I guess Thursday. I'd read about half of it before then, and then just really just found myself swept up in failed state. Tell us about the book and how it fits into the previous two, and why Amazon actually lists this one as "quote unquote" dystopian lawyer book 2. Which I think is a great title, but
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, they never check with you on things like that. They'll assign a series title without actually checking with you. I would have come up with something maybe a little bit more evocative, but. Failed State is my third novel, and it's set in the same, broadly speaking, world or universe, the same messed up mirror America as my prior books, Tropic of Kansas and Rule of Capture. Tropic of Kansas came out in 2017, and Rule of Capture came out in last year in 2019, and Failed State is coming out here this week as we speak. And Failed State is it's a standalone novel. Each of these books is meant to work as a standalone, but it's also a kind of sequel to or follow on in a series with the prior book, Rule of Capture, which told the story of a burnout Houston criminal defense lawyer named Donnie Chemo, who's a lawyer defending people who've been hauled in front of basically political protesters in America, in which too extreme of a protest is deemed a kind of species of treason. In the aftermath of pretty harsh climate change problems and other issues, basically martial law has been declared in parts of the country, and certainly in and around Houston after a big hurricane. And so he's representing people who have been hauled in front of a kind of domestic Guantanamo, and in which people are stripped of their citizenship for their disloyalty to the country, and essentially rendered stateless. And Failed State takes place basically 8 years later, also after the events that are chronicled in Tropic of Kansas, which follows different characters through a much more severely climate change ravaged America. The sort of Tropic of Kansas of the title is basically the American heartland after its sort of complete ecological and economic exhaustion, which is really kind of a somewhat metaphorical or somewhat exaggerated depiction of what I see when I drive around out there still. But Failed State takes place after there's been a kind of general uprising in the United States. The former president, who was basically a charismatic CEO who became a kind of authoritarian plutocrat president, something I imagined before our current actual CEO president came on screen. He's been deposed by the mob, basically, and sort of apparently been assassinated before he could be put up to justice. Our hero, Johnny Chemo, is in kind of rundown state trial civil court in Dallas, one of the few sort of functioning courts left, trying to use old-fashioned personal injury law as a way to get justice for war crimes that otherwise are evading any kind of accountability. And he gets himself into a bit of a personal bind, and to save this one big case on which he's bet all of his chips, to get his last chance at getting some measure of justice for the rotten stuff that has happened, he has to go back into the autonomous zone of the drowned city of New Orleans, where his former revolutionary clients are sort of beta testing their idea of a rewilded green utopia, which includes a kind of environmental truth and reconciliation tribunal in which corporate malfeasors are being held to account for the centuries-long plundering of the American wilderness, and complications ensue. And he's been banished from that community for his own dedication to his own principles and defending the former president from the death penalty. And so his very going back in there and is a kind of a crime in the eyes of the people running this autonomous zone. So it gets a little tricky from there.
And you managed to bring across both, numerous threads while keeping a pretty, hardcore plot and story rolling through too. I mean, you get in, you have the line that there's economic justice through environmental justice, and that seems to permeate this entire work and much of what I've read of yours in the guess, past 2 years, starting with Rule of Capture and the field notes emails.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that idea, it's really an idea that really crystallized with me writing Tropic of Kansas. And Tropic of Kansas is told from the point of view of kind of people living in the margins or outsiders. There's kind of basically a homeless teenager and a black woman who's working as a government employee and kind of just barely getting by within the bowels of the bureaucracy. And as these characters were traveling through this landscape, I had intended to write more of just a kind of a political speculative fiction, imagining what a more authentically participatory democracy 2.0 would look like. But along the way, the characters and I realized that all of the injustices they were trying to fight in their society were really rooted in the damaged relationship that this society had with the land on which it lived. And so, yeah, that idea that to achieve real social justice or economic justice, you need to have a correcting of the kind of environmental and ecological inequities and imbalances that are at the heart of kind of how our very civilization is structured, that you have to tackle that. And not an easy undertaking, but a fun one to explore and an interesting one to try to build an entertaining story around.
Yeah, I mean, it's just weird that, well, again, the town that I described to you where I live, we're the only place, as far as I know, the only U.S. town to be on the Superfund list twice for the same reason. We actually got delisted, and over years they realized we didn't actually clean up everything we thought we were cleaning up and put us back on the list.
Right.
And this is, almost middle of nowhere, 25 miles from New York City, but pretty isolated. And we've got this weird environmental issue, a corporate malfeasance environmental issue that's going on that coincidentally happens to be centered on the one weird ethnic minority section of town. Of all coincidences, all of the paint sludge and the damage and the environmental stuff just happens to be where this particular population lives and not where everybody else lives. It's
which
one
is
of those,
a pretty typical pattern, right?
Yeah. And this is one where historically that population was there, for 100+ years. And then this stuff all starts in the 50s, and lo and behold, 1950s, I should say, because we're way too far into the 21st century at this point. It really does feel like we've we can't keep referring to things as the 90s without really explaining that it was the 1900s. But
well, we're still waiting for the future we were promised by the science fiction of that century. So we still feel, huh?
Yeah, so you're friends with Gibson and Sterling and all those guys. Surely you can get them to speed things up, right?
Well, I think we got kind of the future that they predicted in a lot of respects. I mean, we're sort of living in the cyberpunk future. We're just all the ones. I don't know. We have the cyberpunk future without the capacity for really hacking it. And I think in a way it's a sort of classic example of how every garage band turns into a hair band. The way in which every item of rebellion gets appropriated by capital and turned into something kind of inverted completely into something very different. The way that the unmapped territory of cyberspace, or should I say the liberated territory of cyberspace that was supposed to free us all from the drudgery of monolithic, information silos and office life and 20th century outdated modes of living, turns into this, even much more inhuman machine of corporate surveillance. So we're still waiting for that liberated future to show up, and that's kind of where I'm trying to find my way in these books. But I don't know if I found my way all the way there yet.
Do you see yourself continuing in this universe, or in the
I mean, it's a great question. I don't know. I think my next book will be something different. I think set a little bit closer to contemporary reality. I'm thinking about writing a kind of a cozy catastrophe story, maybe influenced by current events, but and sort of playing around with kind of at the edges of horror, even at the way that nature manifests a kind of an aspect of horror, or a way that a lot of horror is really about nature. And some of this, and kind of similar to what I've been doing in the Field Notes newsletter. But on the other hand, the universe of these books, it's just putting a mirror up to the world I see around me in the U.S. I mean, these books, one thing I'll say about these books are very American. They're very preoccupied with kind of the American scene, and I'm interested in kind of broadening behind that as well. Part of the idea there is, that in the sort of in the very particular, in the very local, you can find your way to the universal. My friend Bruce Sterling, who you just mentioned, Bruce likes to joke about his aspiration to write a regional novel of planet Earth, and there's some of that going on here. But so we'll have to see. I think. I mean, I love this character of Donnie Chemo. The idea of I love the idea of the kind of resuscitating the idea of the underdog lawyer, the kind of outsider lawyer who is really a champion of the people who are not really represented in the justice system or in any other part of the political system, and who himself is a kind of a compromised character in a lot of different ways. And that's a lot of fun. So I like writing these kinds of, trying to reinvent the lawyer story, something I was totally surprised to find I was interested in when it kind of came to me, even though I am also a practicing lawyer. So I may do some more with that, but I think the next book I do along those lines will probably be a little less science fictional and kind of back more to the grounding and into the grit of the present. But who knows? We'll see.
The last couple of months given you optimism along the lines of what's in Failed State, the sense of reorganization. Have you seen anything that gives you sort of green shoots out of this?
I mean,
I capitalized this whole situation to cover 2020 as we know it, but yeah.
I mean, I have thought for a while, without getting too deeply into like partisan political stuff, but I've thought since the 2016 elections that, which for me personally were a pretty shocking and even horrifying outcome that at the same time just revealed truths about the kind of the character of the country, then in some respects the end of American dominance that would come with this effort, this sort of ham-handed effort to perpetuate it in almost a cartoonish, self-parodic way, would be the end of that sort of dominance and the sort of total discrediting of any kind of American exceptionalism, which, I had kind of thought would maybe be healthy for the diminishing of the relative importance of nation states and the movement towards more kinds of global systems of governance of a world that's in climate crisis and that needs a little bit more of that than we have right now, right? But and so you're kind of seeing that now. I mean, failed state indeed, as people were sort of talking about the U.S. is actually looking like a bit of a failed state in the current environment. And it's a very strange experience as a writer to like conjure up scenes like the scenes of Tropic of Kansas of kind of like, rebellious mobs outside a barricaded White House, taking on federal troops.
Yeah.
And, people declaring autonomous zones in liberated parts of the city. And, people being disappeared into Chrysler minivans by masked soldiers on the streets of, major metropolises. Those are all like images that they're very resonant with the things in these books. And you'll turn on the news and you'd be like, oh my God, it's like, sort of truly horrifying and unsettling. And on the one hand, it's kind of like, oh, I guess, yeah, it's sort of, I guess I anticipated some of this kind of zeitgeist in a way, but this is not like a good feeling because you think you're setting out to exaggerate kind of emergent trends in order to imagine how to, find your way to a healthier place. And then these things just kind of, explode in plain sight, and it's not pretty. So it's really depressing to see the kind of breakdown of any kind of capacity for political civility, and the accelerationist in me hopes that this is like the beginning of the end or the path to something much fresher and newer, but we'll see.
But on the flip side, do you look at those groups forming their autonomous zones? Do you look at, people being labeled as essential labor and realizing, they might have a little more leverage than they thought they did going into the past 6 months in any way that's a positive? Or that potentially points.
I've been sort of baffled since the elections and as to why people don't take to the streets more to actually act up about these issues, or why people in the establishment don't use the available instruments of the judicial system, of the kind of other levers of power and kind of counter power to try to deal with the current situation. So seeing people finally realizing like, oh yeah, we can, with little sort of leaderless groups of people kind of coalescing into organized protest, start to have a real impact. But I don't see, on the one hand, the kind of coalescence of like awakening around the BLM movement seems like a really positive thing. And I feel like there's sort of real mind shift there. But in terms of any real changes in the fundamental system, I don't really see any fresh thinking on those lines. And I think all people are just fighting for like, can we please go back to normal? Normal being like kind of what you were talking about earlier about like the 90s. Can we go back to, we just have like normal politicians? But there's this idea that the core constitutional structure is this like sacrosanct thing, as if it's like as if it's like commandments handed down to us by perfected beings or something, when it's just this sort of living negotiation, right? And I think people could be more imaginative about where they're aiming to get to. And that's kind of partly what failed state is about. It's like, okay, well, again, back to the 90s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the quote unquote end of history as described by Francis Fukuyama, this sort of long line of utopian visions that had provided a really important aspirational dipole in Western political thought, going back to the Enlightenment, of like, the idea that, you can engineer a society that brings out the best in people, that you can get to, progressively get toward a more just society that whole idea seems kind of gone from our discourse. And so like reinvigorating that in some meaningful way, I think is a worthy undertaking and an interesting project of which science fiction is capable of contributing to.
Well, you do have the line in the book that people are too chicken shit. They're afraid of real justice because they know if we get it, it might come for them next.
Yeah, well, it's just like, I don't know. Someone was asking me if I thought, like some of the current people that many of us consider to be engaged in criminal behavior and holding public office would ever face justice after an election that threw them out. And, I'm always very skeptical about that. I mean, the because the people who make those decisions are all politicians, and politicians are all very terrified of the idea of people being held criminally accountable for things that are at the margins of, politics and power. And so, nobody that I've been able to see ever has been held accountable really in any way at all, not even politically, for the kind of horrifying things that went on during the War on Terror. The lawyers who wrote the situationally ethical memos that excused all of that all got sweet, law school jobs, and the people who actually gave the orders are, sitting pretty on their ranches. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm sort of skeptical that there will ever be any real accountability for those folks, but you never know.
That's the guy who did the torture memos, actually. John Yoo, he's consulting for Trump on how else to expand executive power. As far as I know, that's his current gig.
Well, he's a professor at Bolt Hall at Berkeley at the law school. But yeah, I've seen that too, and it's just like, yeah, oh great, that's sort of perfect, right?
Yeah.
So that's getting ready for this. If you think the first term was bad, wait till you see the second term, and just be glad you're not an undocumented alien living in the absolute accountability free zone where there's like real horror shows going on as we speak.
Yeah, how is, I don't even know how to describe it, that ecosystem around where you are in terms of undocumented people and, well, in New Jersey considers itself a sanctuary state along those lines. How is Austin, East Austin, in those terms?
I mean, well, there are different realities that kind of coexist here, right? It's colonized space, and in a way, the whole country is, but here in the border zone, you really feel it in Texas. And but I know people from a lot of different parts of this region and communities that kind of are here sharing the same space, and I think that. In some respects, it's kind of normalized. It was a lot scarier in 2017 when there were, these kind of horrific things, where they would, people would like wake up in the night and there's like, armored ICE vehicles patrolling their neighborhood, going door to door and like looking for people and trying to do kind of roundups, the kinds of things that I think are depicted in this documentary series that has just been released on Netflix that ICE tried to shut down. But the stuff going on now, like at the border, that's really horrific, involves, mostly people who are, young immigrants, refugees from the horror show of contemporary Central America, and aren't really tied in with these more longstanding communities here, which are typically, a lot of the undocumented aliens here where I live, people I know, they're from northern Mexico, and they've been here since the 90s, many of them. But the stuff going on down there, like there was this report this week that ProPublica came out with about these networks of like weird little like, business and tourist hotels in these border towns that are full of these children who were unaccompanied minors who were being sent back. I mean, I read they had one. It was like an 8-month-old child was sent back into Mexico, accompanied by her, 8-year-old sibling. So that stuff. And there are detention facilities here around Austin, and there are a lot of lawyers who spend a lot of time trying to find some level of justice for those folks. But that whole system is kind of, it's not even a real judicial system that you have access to for most of those folks. It's sort of administrative courts, blah, blah, blah. But in Austin, you have this funny thing of and throughout Texas, the like construction business and all of these folks who are working in those trades. And with the pandemic, because of the kind of the politics around real estate, those were all, initially it was like, well, only certain construction projects are going to be allowed to continue in operation. And there was a big backlash, and basically all the municipal governments just caved, as did the state government. So construction projects have just continued apace. And now with the second wave, it started to hit the people who work in these construction sites really badly. And that's starting to have a real impact on that community. The kind of the more long-term community here.
Yeah, it's been amazing to me in terms of the day job stuff that I do. When you hear the Republican bright line is employee protection from worker lawsuits. That's the one thing McConnell wouldn't flex on the next COVID relief package. And simultaneously, let's cut everybody's unemployment benefits to send them back into the workforce while we're gutting their protections.
Yeah, it's a great irony in Texas.
Yeah.
Oh,
so you see it play out on a nationwide level and a state level like this.
Yeah, I mean, in Texas, the sort of Texas economic miracle or whatever, where it's rarely acknowledged how much of that is built on the backs of immigrant labor, especially in the construction business and in agriculture to some extent. And it's certain to a great extent down in the Rio Grande Valley, and the way that overlays with this census hijinks around, looking at active ways to undercount and so on, is sort of interesting from a political power standpoint. So we'll see how all that plays out. But but we'll see what the world looks like in a year in that regard.
Yeah. Speaking of, as a guy who can't get off his ass and actually produce anything, I'm wondering, did you put out 3 books in 4 years solely to make me feel like more of a failure? Or
I don't know.
Was this your natural thing?
It took me, the last one was hard. I mean, I put out 3 books in 4 years. I mean, the first one I was working on for a while, and it took me a little longer than I would have liked for a variety of reasons to get a novel in print that I was happy with. So maybe there was a little bit of, making up for lost time there. I didn't really think much about the calendar for these last 2 books when my editor proposed it to me. I liked the idea of getting these 2 books out back to back in a way that would, be kind of in conversation with the zeitgeist. I mean, there was some thought to that, and I have a pretty good, work method, but it's tricky. I mean, I wrote Failed State in a year in which I had a brother with whom I was very close unexpectedly die and deal with all of the issues attendant to that. My adult son got married in another country across the Pacific Ocean where he lives, and obviously had to travel for that. And then I became a dad again. With birth of my new daughter a month later, and the singularly joyous event. But so it was a year of a lot of other stuff going on. Well, also working on this book, launching Rule of Capture, and maintaining.
You're just making me feel worse.
A law practice. So there was some. It was. To do it, I basically had a period of, I don't know, like 3 months where I was getting up at 4 a.m. every day to kind of hit it. So, yeah, it was intense. And, but I think, it is tricky. I think, a lot of writers I admire have the luxury of taking all of the time they want with a work, and to try to get it as close to perfection as they can. I think that, I don't know, that must be nice, but I feel like with these kinds of works, there's a tension between the kind of improvisational jazz of fresh prose and the kind of like, diamond-like chiseling of crystalline sentences that comes with, continuously reworking the material. And I try to find my way somewhere in the two, and, hopefully it works. And so, yeah, I'm right now just getting kind of geared up to start another one. So we'll see what kind of schedule I come up for that.
Has your relationship with established writers changed over the course of 3 books in 4 years? Do you find yourself talking differently with some of the maybe the writing idols you have, as well as other writers you're close with?
Sure, you become more like peers. You feel like you've got and you kind of have your own trajectory going, and you gain an appreciation of a lot of the challenges that people face. And I think my good friend, one of those people would fall in that category, is the writer Maureen Mchugh. And I remember seeing Maureen at a convention in Dallas right after Tropic of Kansas came out, and she was like, "Congratulations, and book's great." And now what you're going to find out is that after you finish the first book or any book, you think you have figured out how to write a novel. But what you realize is you've only learned how to write that novel. And every book is different and has its own problems. And in particular, writing any kind of work of science fiction that's set in the future, or in what will read to people like the future. These books are not really set. Failed State more so, but they're not really set in the future so much as kind of alternate versions of the now. That's become a really challenging undertaking, right? In a world in which we can't even get a beat on the present, right? So especially to write like near future fiction, it's just like super challenging. So I think, I think a lot of people who write that kind of work, they find it particularly challenging, and it's interesting to see how people are trying to tackle that problem right now. I don't know, like with the pandemic, on the one hand, Failed State, I'm sort of like, okay, well, this kind of works because it's set in, in the aftermath of a nation-breaking crisis that has kind of decimated the economy and even caused, extreme food insecurity. And, it kind of feels a little bit in conversation with the moment in ways I wouldn't have anticipated. But still, I think there's going to be pre-pandemic fiction and post-pandemic fiction. And I think anything that's set in a world of the before time is gonna feel like weirdly quaint, Even like I read the daily funnies. I get the daily, like the King Features Syndicate has a daily email of their comic strips, and I read them for the vintage comic strips, which are wonderfully done things, beautiful little works of popular art. And that's the perfect way to experience them, is through that daily format, the way they were designed to be written and enjoyed. But the new ones, like the street comments, the like Judge Parkers and Rex Morgan's MDs and Mary Worths and all that, it's really funny to see how they're like processing the pandemic in their world, when suddenly, there's suddenly the characters in Judge Parker are all wearing face coverings. And it's just, I don't know. It's very strange.
I would just love to see Mark Trail not even know what's going on. That, he'd be out in the woods and have no clue that anything had happened. I think that would be pretty neat, but,
It's a pretty good idea, or have him come back from a trip into the, like Rip Van Winkle, to the post-pandemic reality outside Lost Forest.
Yeah, the only strip I read is Macanudo by Liniers, that Argentine cartoonist I recorded with last year.
I love Macanudo.
He's so good.
Liniers, he's a genius. I mean, it's a wonderfully done strip. And as somebody with a now 15-month-old daughter who I've started, it appears in the Sunday edition of our local paper here, and that we still get in print, and I love showing it to her. And it's a beautifully done. It's so exciting to me to see a new, at least in the American milieu, a new daily comic that takes that form in new directions and realize some of its artistic and narrative promise in fresh ways. It's really exciting. And I hope it portends more things like that. And it's really exciting to see stuff that comes from another language and another cultural idiom to get kind of translated over to here, sort of literally and figuratively.
Yeah, he's something. I saw him do a live presentation at CXC in Columbus, and then we got together next time he was going to be in New York. But seeing someone who has not just the imagination and technical chops, but can still be funny in the midst of that, because you can run into being a little too cutesy formally for your own good and ultimately be kind of lifeless. But yeah, he weds that stuff absolutely perfectly. And, he's pals with Manu Ginobili, so we got to bond over, the Spurs and the Argentina Blue Wave basketball team. So.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I actually brought I do have an Argentine, I forget the name of it, but it's the Blue Waves. I brought the basketball jersey for when we got together so that he could see and get the whole story as to how I ended up possessing one of these things. But anyway, speaking of comics, what are you reading in that form?
In the comics form? I mean,
not just strips, but yeah.
Not a lot in terms of like newer graphic novels. I mean, I read Chris Ware's Rusty Brown earlier this year, which is just like a masterpiece. And maybe I'm just afraid nothing will be able to top that experience. But yeah, I'm like devouring these, 1940s and 1950s comics in my daily feed. I'm particularly keen on this one called Radio Patrol, which is just these guys about these it starts in the 1930s, and I've been reading this feed for 15 plus years now. So now I'm into the 50s, but I've mostly been kind of binging on books and movies with attention to this new project I'm thinking about, kind of at the margins of horror, and reading in particular a lot of kind of Latin American horror by women writers, which I think is a really particularly interesting genre that no one has ever classified as such. And the work kind of comes from a lot of different, generic categorizations in its own cultures. But like works like I'm reading this book, Distancia de Rescate by Samantha Schweblin, who's an Argentine writer. It's out in the U.S. as Fever Dream, and a kind of like ecological, environmental, obliquely horror story about kind of the consequences of pesticide use. And I'm reading Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, Temporales Huracanes, which is a Mexican story that's like intensely profound that just came out. And and then I guess even some like other kind of, I'm reading stuff like I've never really paid much attention to Shirley Jackson. I've been digging into Shirley Jackson, and I just saw her. The New Yorker just this summer republished her story, The Lottery, which I thought was like a very interesting thing in the kind of the summer fiction issue. And then I've been reading. There's a kind of the original cozy catastrophe novel, which I never read before, which is The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. I've read other books by Wyndham, but I wanted to kind of see how those books are structured, because I'm interested in kind of unpacking that story model and kind of repurposing it for very different towards very different ends.
Yeah, how much have you learned that as a skill? How much of that came once you started publishing? That sense of having to break down, or at least trying to understand, the models on a technical level, on top of everything else that goes into it.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of, I think you sometimes you have an idea of a character or of a kind of story you want to tell. And you start to work on it and you think about the precedents and what were the things that you enjoyed about them. And then as you dig into it, you're like, oh, well, but if I want to do this, I want to do this, in a way that's consonant with my values and to kind of take it in a different direction. And so, with Tropic of Kansas, I was kind of playing with the material of adventure fiction and even like those kind of sword and sorcery, Robert E. Howard, Conan the Barbarian type stories they're kind of like, picaresque pulp wanderings and of like post-war, post-World War II adventures fiction, even the so-called men's adventure stuff. And as you dig into it, you realize you want to kind of like actively hack it. You got to really understand the bones, because I wanted to take it in a very different direction, kind of politically and otherwise. And then, with Rule of Capture, it was like the lawyer story. And I had never really paid that much attention to the kind of legal thriller category, which, or even to kind of courtroom dramas. And so I binged on those a lot and learned a great deal about kind of what really makes those stories tick. And once you realize that, they're not really about, like, lawyer stories in American fiction are not really about getting innocent people off. They're about doing bad things and getting away with it. That really opens up sort of fresh new territory. And, and the idea of the innocent client as being kind of an illusory thing, that really suits, I think, taking a novel in an interesting direction. So with Failed State, it was like the idea of the utopian novel. And that's a really weird genre, because one, the things that are sort of true utopias aren't really novels, because, utopia is like the Talking Heads song Heaven, a place where nothing ever happens. A place where, it's all about community and not about the self, which is the singular preoccupation of the novel. And there are things that all kind of utopian novels do that, like this book does, there's always you have to kind of get like the literal tour of the new community, and try to do that in a way that's sort of fun and fresh and interesting. But what's most interesting about, you realize how the really great utopian novels, most of which are works of science fiction, like The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, or Pacific Edge by Kim Stanley Robinson, Aspects of the Female Man by Joanna Russ. they're all sort of compromised. They're places in which this putatively utopian community exists in tension with an outside world that operates on different terms, and it's flawed. And it's like utopia. Utopia is not a place; it's a decision. It's sort of a decision to try to try to live a better life, or to try to craft a more wholesome community. And so trying to look at those precedents and figure out how to make them work on my own terms was an interesting challenge. And the one easy way to solve it, the problem of having, the absence of conflict in the community, is you just put a lawyer in it and there's your conflict. So.
Now, since we talked last, a documentary TV episode chronicled your house, which I knew nothing about. And you kept referring to like an Airstream every time we talked. And I just had this assumption that you were living in a trailer sort of thing, and had no clue that you had this amazing construction and sort of environmentally integrated home built over the last couple of years over a former pipeline. People started showing up or anything with the, "Hey, I saw this thing about your house, man." Any weirdness ensue?
Well, we already, in Austin, where we live, people already kind of know about, they kind of know the weird house. I mean, you do a TV show, and you start hearing from people. I mean, I've had a lot of, I've made a lot of new friends, in quotes, and people have contacted me about projects they're interested in that are simpatico with it. And that's the thing. I mean, I think one of the things about that documentary, which was part of the Apple TV series Home, speaking of Utopian, which is a pretty utopian series, but it was about more than just like our house project, which is basically a kind of a post-industrial, postmodern bunker built into a former brownfield site that has a green roof, and it's kind of like a hobbit house from the future or something. But it's really about the idea of bringing back the wild within the heart of the city. They made it more than just a home show. They made it a documentary about this as an example of various sorts of projects like that going on in East Austin to kind of remedy the history of kind of environmental justice in this particular part of town, and tied into the petrochemical industry, and the idea of kind of imagining greener futures in a way that I think was sort of authentically utopian and pretty cool. And it was a fun thing to be part of in that respect.
I did learn more about your personal life from that half hour than I have from the multiple conversations you and I have had, which I take as a failing on my part and not yours.
Well, no, I'm not, like I'm sure if you talk to the director who did that episode, I mean, I think he had to work so hard to get any of that out of me. I don't know why that show, it's like reality television at its core, even though it's like super high end and, not really focused on drama, but personal drama, but still they want, personal melodrama or elements of it. And I sort of feel like I'm so fortunate in my life. I've been pretty, privileged to be kind of like a middle class white guy growing up in this country, and my problems pale compared to anybody else's, and I'm not here to whine about them. I'm here to talk about how I can try to, put my good fortune to work helping others, whether it's through building a house that tries to generate a net ecological surplus, or use my skills as a lawyer to try to, work for things that I think have add a net benefit or help people who otherwise wouldn't even have access to a lawyer, or hopefully try to write books that contribute some fresh perspective into the conversation and help people entertain them while also helping them kind of see the world around them in a different light. Oh. So yeah, it's not easy to get me to like gab about personal stuff, really.
Oh, good. I feel like less of a self-absorbed failure then. Although, again, that's my brand. So
I wouldn't say that. Quite the opposite. You're a pretty great conversationalist.
That's the. Thanks, man. The other great thing I learned was that either you or your wife bought the same bookcase I did from Design Within Reach. That story bookcase, the.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. Well, the house has such weird lines. It's like book storage is a problem. And
it doesn't matter what shape house you have, book storage will always be a problem. It's okay.
I saw that in the home of a friend of mine. There's this Norwegian free jazz bass player, a buddy of mine named Ingebrigt Hecker Flaten. He's a total badass. He's quarantined in Uppdal back home, but his home base is in Austin, and he had one of those, and I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, it's a pretty sweet bookcase, vertical stack. That's the one. I keep it in the bedroom, so for kind of whatever my bedtime reading stack is.
Yeah, that's become my upcoming pod guest shelf. I was using book carts for that, and now I figure, okay, let me put the upcoming guests who I know I have to get to. I'll put those books on the story, vertical thing, and that way I can always see them when I come down the stairs and feel guilty that I haven't started them yet. But
that's genius.
Yeah, that's me and my thing, man. That's been one of the tough parts early on in the pandemic, was that everybody was sending me PDFs instead of review copies, and just not the same thing. I had to do an e-copy or a e-version of your book also, and it's just still not the same for me as sitting down with a hard copy.
No, it's tough. I mean, and it's tough for the writers, and it's tough for the publicists who have to try to get people to take a look at the books, because people like physical books. Yeah, it's a very challenging year overall in which to launch a book in a year, but not as challenging as it would be to be running a bookstore. So,
no. And I had the same thing with the publicist. I was like, I don't want your people in warehouses picking books off a shelf to pack them for me. April and May, I'm like, that's fine. I'll take an I'll take a PDF. Not an issue. I don't want to put somebody else's life at risk because, I'm a dick, which we do on a daily basis. But, if I can reduce that, I guess that's sort of what we're getting at through this entire conversation.
It's a great point, and it's a good way in which this has maybe helped us all be more conscious of the layers of labor that we benefit from in this 21st century economy that we exist in, that seems to make life so easy for some. But I finally got Friday morning, a few days before we were taping this, I got my first physical copy of this book, and it's a nice thing to see, because it has a hot pink cover as it worked out in the design process, which is a fun thing to see on a book, and that you don't see very often.
It is, at least the PDF I've seen is gorgeous, the cover design. So, I'll make sure we get a nice image of that up on the show notes page for this one.
Sounds good.
So cool, man. Good luck with the book launch. Do we want to put given how stupidly optimistic we were in April, any timeline in which, you want to guess that you and I will be sitting down at a table again in person?
I think that I don't think anything is going to be any less crazy in this country until sometime in the first or second quarter of next year. Because I think
you're still too optimistic. Yeah.
Well, I'm just talking. The pace of the political insanity is only going to accelerate. And the feeling that we're living in some Ballardian self-parody that would be funny if it weren't so horrifying and real, that's going to continue. And, it's like Rule of Capture is, my book from last year takes place after there's a presidential election and it's not clear who won. And and then the real fighting begins, and I'll just hope that we don't have to deal with that on top of a pandemic. But it's kind of what it's those portents are in the air, at least.
Yeah. So we'll call this one Dystopian Lawyer Podcast number 3 Does that sound good?
It works for me. So, but
Cool,
yeah,
man.
we'll keep crawling our way through the wreckage toward the utopian beginnings on the other side.
Sounds awesome. Thanks for coming on, Chris.
All right. Thanks for having me, Gil.
And that was Christopher Brown. His new book is Failed State from Harper Voyager, out this week, and you can find it at bookstores everywhere. Go pick it up along with Rule of Capture, also featuring Donnie Chemo, and Tropic of Kansas, Chris's first novel, which kicked off his whole Kansas verse. You should also check out ChristopherBrown.com, which is spelled just like it sounds, and all one word, to find out more about Chris and his work and some of the appearances he's going to be making on a virtual tour for Failed State. And from there, you can subscribe to his great weekly email, Field Notes, which you can also find at edgelands.substack.com. Chris is on Twitter as NB_Chris and on Instagram as ebitdada, which is EBITDADA. There'll be links to all this in the show notes, along with a link to the episode of Home on Apple TV Plus that shows Chris's amazing house and, as we said during the conversation, reveals far more about his life than I managed to suss out from our 3 previous conversations. Now, in the before time, this is when I would ask you guys for financial support through Patreon or PayPal. I don't do that anymore. I still have those venues open, but the support you can show me, just drop me an email, send me a letter or a postcard. That's all I need. But when it comes to supporting people financially, there are plenty of artists, writers, and non-combatants who could use your help right now, who are in dire economic straits. If you're not comfortable helping individuals, there are plenty of institutions and foundations and nonprofits you can help fund, especially food banks, freedom funds, environmental law funds, which I'm sure Chris will have plenty of links to, and more. So we're in a really tenuous time right now. I know money's tight for a lot of people, but if you can spare anything and help people, then help them. Now, as far as the one thing I always end with, I still have some copies left of my very first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. It is not a collection of haiku, although there are some haiku in it. It's 32 pages of my writing, photography, and a podcast excerpt. If you want one, it's free. Just drop me a line or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and hit me up that way. You can kick in a couple of bucks for postage and production if you want, but don't feel obliged. This isn't about money. This is about art. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.